Welcome to the Philosophical Odysseys podcast.
It is a genuine privilege to be sitting down for this one. We have a remarkably complex landscape to navigate today.
We really do. And just to establish the ground rules right out of the gate for those of you listening, while Philosophical Odysseys is the title of today's special thematic exploration, the format you are about to hear is our signature deep dive into the source material.
Right, exactly.
We are going to be doing what we do best, taking a massive stack of historical research and philosophical texts and charting the ontological journey of women through the entire history of Western thought.
Which is an incredibly ambitious topic.
Massively.
I mean, we are talking about tracing the very concept of warm, from ancient Greece all the way to modern sociological theory. But it is fundamentally necessary to understand the world we actually live in.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to unpack how the category of woman has been constructed, fiercely deconstructed, and, continually reconstructed by history's greatest thinkers.
Right, because we are going to explore how abstract philosophical frameworks, these ideas debated centuries ago, are actually the architectural blueprints of your modern social reality.
They really are. These aren't just dusty arguments relegated to university libraries. They dictate legal codes, workplace dynamics, and deeply ingrained behavioral expectations.
And that is the crucial hook here. Whether you have a degree in philosophy or you are simply curious about how society arrived at its current assumptions, we are going to translate these massive paradigm shifts without burying you in academic jargon.
Exactly.
We want to hold up a mirror to history and examine who actually manufactured that mirror, who was allowed to hold it, and who was merely reflected in it.
I love that analogy.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So to do that, we have to start with a very specific date that anchors so much of this global conversation. I want to talk about March 8th, widely known as International Women's Day.
Oh, yes, the origin story.
Right, because if you stop the average person on the street and ask them for the origin story of that date, you will almost certainly hear a very specific, incredibly tragic narrative.
You will hear the story of March 8th, 1857.
Right. The prevailing narrative is that on this exact date in 1857, female textile workers in New York City went on strike to protest horrendous working conditions and demand a 10-hour workday. According to the story, the police and factory owners locked them inside, a fire broke out, and 129 women burned to death. It is this devastating, visceral image of capitalist exploitation and feminist martyrdom.
It feels like the perfect, albeit horrific, origin story for a day dedicated to women's rights.
It really does.
It does feel perfect,
Yeah.
Which is precisely why it warrants strict historical scrutiny. When researchers and historians actually went into the municipal archives of New York City to document this foundational event, they encountered a profound anomaly.
Okay.
The historical record for March 8, 1857 tells a completely different story. First, a simple calendar check reveals that March 8th of that year fell on a Sunday.
Wait, a Sunday?
A Sunday. And in 1850s New York, factories were closed on Sundays.
So there were no workers to lock inside.
None. There were no workers there.
That is a rather large red flag.
Is the first of many. More importantly, when historians scoured the contemporary New York newspapers, police blotters, and fire department records, they found absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
No strike, no fire, no mass casualty event. A tragedy resulting in the deaths of 129 women in the middle of Manhattan would have dominated the press for weeks. It would have sparked outrage and municipal investigations.
Of course it would.
But the historical silence is absolute. The event simply did not happen.
I want to stop you right there because if an event of that magnitude is a complete fabrication, how on earth did it become the bedrock origin story for a globally recognized United Nations sanctioned day?
Right.
People don't just invent a mass casualty fire out of thin air and convince the entire world it happened.
Well, to understand the mechanics of that fabrication, we have to look past the 19th century and fast forward to the ideological battlegrounds of the 20th century, specifically the Cold War.
Okay. The Cold War.
Yes. This is a masterclass in what historians call memory design. The story of the 1857 fire didn't actually appear in global print until 1955. It was published in the French communist newspaper, L'Humanité.
Interesting timing.
Very. Now, you have to look at the geopolitical board at that moment. March 8th already existed as a prominent day of celebration, but its roots were deeply, inextricably tied to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc.
So Western labor movements and feminist organizations were caught in a bind.
Exactly.
They recognized the utility and power of having a unified international day to rally around. But in the McCarthy-era paranoia of the 1950s, they couldn't possibly be seen celebrating a Soviet holiday.
They needed to claim the day, but they had to sever its communist umbilical cord. They needed an origin story that felt Western, that was rooted in the labor struggle, but was entirely decoupled from Russian history.
So they made one up.
What historians suggest happened is an act of historical projection. The narrative architects took the visceral horror of real, documented industrial tragedies, most notably the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York in 1911, which did tragically kill 146 garment workers, and projected those elements backward in time to the arbitrary date of March 8, 1857.
Wow.
They engineered a myth that served a profound political necessity.
It is a staggering realization about how history is consumed. We tend to view history as a static collection of objective facts, but it is so often a dynamic, fiercely contested narrative shaped by whoever holds cultural power.
Absolutely.
But this begs the ultimate question. If the 1857 New York fire is a Cold War phantom, what actually happened to cement March 8th on the calendar? There has to be a real catalyst.
The true catalyst is one of the most consequential events of the 20th century. We have to look at Russia in 1917.
Okay, set the scene for us.
On February 23rd of the Julian calendar, which crucially translates exactly to March 8th on the Gregorian calendar used by the rest of the world, tens of thousands of Russian female textile workers in Petrograd walked out of their factories. They went on a massive militant strike.
And their demands weren't just about factory hours, were they?
No, they were striking under the banner of bread and peace. They were protesting the catastrophic food shortages, the millions of lives lost in World War I, and a suffocating autocratic rule of the Tsar.
This was a serious uprising.
This was not a polite demonstration. These women marched to other factories, calling the male workers out to join them. This specific strike on March 8th is widely recognized by historians as the spark that ignited the Russian Revolution.
That is
It
incredible.
paralyzed the capital and shook the Romanov dynasty so profoundly that within days, the Tsar was forced to abdicate.
Just pause and consider the sheer scale of that for a second. A strike initiated by women demanding basic survival needs bread and an end to a senseless war literally topples a centuries-old empire.
And as a direct result, the provisional government that took over was forced to grant women the right to vote.
That is an incredibly powerful, factual origin story. Why was the idea of an international day already in the ether, though? The Petrograd strike didn't happen in a vacuum?
You are right to point that out. The conceptual groundwork had been laid a few years prior. In 1910, at the International Socialist Women's Conference in Copenhagen, a prominent German activist named Clara Zetkin proposed the creation of an annual international day to press for women's demands.
But she didn't have a date yet.
Exactly. She didn't attach a specific date to it. It was a fluid, strategic concept. It wasn't until the monumental empire-toppling events of 1917 that the date was locked in. By 1921, at the International Communist Women's Conference in Moscow, March 8th was officially adopted as Working Women's Day to explicitly honor the women of Petrograd.
So let me get this straight. It starts as a highly radical, regime-changing socialist strike.
Yes.
Then, during the Cold War, it gets a fabricated West End backstory involving a mythical New York fire to make it palatable to capitalist democracies.
Correct.
And then the final layer of paint is applied in 1977 when the United Nations officially recognizes March 8th as International Women's Day. And in doing so, they essentially sanitize it. They smooth off all the radical, anti-imperialist labor strike edges and turn it into a universal calendar event.
It goes from a riot for bread and peace to corporate breakfast panels.
Exactly. It is the ultimate example of institutional assimilation. So what does this all mean?
Well, the reason our sources highlight this historical dialectic so prominently is because it perfectly sets the stage for the philosophical journey we are about to take.
Right.
If the historical record of women's actions can be so easily overwritten, redesigned, and sanitized by competing power structures, we have to ask a much deeper question. How has the very concept of what a woman has been designed by the architects of our intellectual history?
That brings us straight to the bedrock of Western thought. We are traveling back to antiquity to examine what our sources identify as the ontological deficit.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the bedrock of Western philosophy, you inevitably have to deal with Aristotle. He is a foundational pillar, a polymath who categorized the world. But his biological and political frameworks regarding women have cast a shadow that lasted for millennia.
To truly grasp how Aristotle viewed women, we cannot just look at isolated quotes. We have to understand his core metaphysical system.
Okay, let's break that down.
Aristotle operated on a theory known as hylomorphism. This is the concept of matter versus form. Aristotle posited that everything in the natural physical world is a combination of two elements. You have matter, which is the raw, chaotic potential material,
Mm-hmm.
and you have form, which is the active organizing principle that imposes shape, identity, and purpose onto that matter.
I think we need to ground that in an analogy for the listener because hylomorphism is a heavy concept. How did he apply this to human biology?
The analogy Aristotle himself used, which our sources highlight, is the relationship between a sculptor and a block of marble. In the context of human reproduction, Aristotle viewed the active male sperm as the sculptor. The male principle provides the form, the soul, the rational blueprint, the spark of life.
And the female.
The female contribution, which he identified as menstrual blood, was viewed entirely as the passive block of marble. The female provides nothing but the raw, unformed matter. The female body is merely the inert clay waiting to be organized and animated by the active male principle.
It is an incredibly stark mechanical view of reproduction. The male is the artist, the female is the material. But Aristotle takes this biological assumption and pushes it to a deeply concerning philosophical conclusion, doesn't he?
He does. Because Aristotle believed that the male principle is pure activity and perfection, he concluded that nature always inherently aims for the male form. Therefore, a female is essentially a deviation from nature's intended target. He famously and brutally referred to women as mutilated males or a deformity of nature. His argument was that if the reproductive process goes perfectly, with sufficient heat and vitality, the result is a male. If there's a lack of heat or some failure in the realization of the form, the result falls short of perfection and you get a female.
Mutilated males. It is hard to overstate the damage that phrase caused over the next 2,000 years. It establishes what the sources call an ontological deficit.
Yes, exactly.
He is saying that at the very level of being, women are defined by a lack. They do not possess their own complete independent category of existence. They are simply a failed attempt at being a man.
That is the core of it.
But what is truly wild to me is how seamlessly Aristotle translates this wildly speculative biology into hard political reality.
That is where the philosophical rubber meets the road. Biological assumptions rarely stay confined to biology. They inevitably become the architecture of societal cages. Because Aristotle viewed women as biologically incomplete, he naturally concluded they were rationally incomplete. Their capacity for logos, for rigorous deliberative reason, was supposedly defective. Now, in the context of ancient Greece, rigorous rationality was the sole ticket to the polis.
The polis being the public sphere, the realm of politics, philosophy, lawmaking, and citizenship.
Precisely. Because men supposedly possess full, uninhibited rationality, the polis belongs exclusively to them. It is the arena of the fully formed human.
So where does that leave women?
It confines them to the oikos, the private sphere, the household. Their designated domain is biological reproduction, managing the estate, and sustaining the daily physical needs of life. They are systematically shut out of the realm where history is shaped and ideas are debated, relegated to the cyclical, hidden maintenance work of the home.
But I want to push back slightly on painting Aristotle as nothing more than a cartoon villain here, because our sources note a nuance in his thinking. He didn't think women were useless, did he? He just viewed their utility through a very specific instrumental lens.
That is a critical distinction. Aristotle was not operating at a pure, chaotic malice. He was constructing a highly ordered, interconnected worldview. He actually believed that the proper management and welfare of women was absolutely vital to the survival and stability of the state.
Right. He criticized Sparta for this.
He did. He heavily criticized the society of Sparta. He argued that because the Spartans neglected the proper regulation and moral welfare of their women, their entire societal fabric was fundamentally weakened. He explicitly wrote that if the condition of women is poor, half of life is ruined.
It's a fascinating paradox. He sees them as vital, but only in the way a farmer sees topsoil as vital.
That's a good way to put it.
Good soil is essential for a strong crop, but the soil doesn't own the farm. He values women instrumentally for their capacity to support and produce the male citizens who actually participate in the polis. They are necessary parts of a whole, but they are never permitted to be independent subjects with their own agency.
And that specific conceptual framework, the idea that a woman's value is entirely relative to her function for others rather than inherent to herself, proves to be incredibly resilient. It survives the fall of Rome, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. It mutates, but it doesn't die.
In fact, it survives right into the era that supposedly championed universal freedom.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the 18th century and what we might call the Enlightenment's paradoxical blind spot. For those of you listening, picture the Enlightenment. This is the era of sweeping away absolute monarchs, rejecting religious dogma, and championing the light of universal reason.
It's the age of liberty.
Right. The
Mhm.
philosophers of this era are writing grand treatises on liberty, equality, the inherent rights of man. But when you look closer, you realize that the word universal had a massive silent asterisk next to it.
It is arguably one of the greatest hypocrisies in the history of intellectual thought. The Enlightenment thinkers were quite literally designing a new world order predicated on the idea that all human beings possess rational minds, and because of that rationality, they deserve political freedom.
But not women.
Yet when it came to women, these towering intellectuals performed incredible philosophical gymnastics to carve out exceptions. We have to examine Immanuel Kant here. Kant is the titan of modern philosophy, renowned for his rigorous, unyielding ethical systems.
Kant is the guy who says you must act out of pure moral duty regardless of the consequences. But when he writes about aesthetics and gender, he creates a conceptual trap that fundamentally undermines a woman's status as a moral being.
He divided human traits and experiences into two distinct categories, the sublime and the beautiful.
Yes, and this division is incredibly telling.
For Kant, the sublime represents depth, theoretical understanding, vastness, awe, and the capacity for rigorous moral duty. It is the realm of profound intellectual struggle. And, unsurprisingly, Kant assigns the sublime exclusively to men.
Of course he does.
Men, in his view, are capable of deep abstract philosophical thought and of acting strictly out of principled moral duty. The beautiful, on the other hand, represents surface-level charm, pleasantness, emotional resonance, and aesthetics. He assigns the beautiful to women.
He argued that women are naturally inclined toward what is charming and agreeable rather than what is deeply theoretical or rigorously ethical.
Yes.
At first glance, someone might hear that and think, well, he thinks women are pleasant and men are serious. It's a stereotype, but is it really that dangerous? But there is a massive philosophical danger lurking in that distinction, isn't there?
A profound danger. You have to remember Kant's core definition of ethics. For Kant, true ethical behavior requires acting out of a rational understanding of duty, often pushing against your natural inclinations.
Right.
If he defines women as creatures of the beautiful, meaning they act primarily out of a desire to please, be agreeable, or out of emotional sympathy, he is essentially stripping them of ethical agency in his own system.
Wow.
If you are just doing something because it feels nice or makes people like you, you aren't a moral subject. You are just compliant.
He is quietly suggesting that women might be psychologically incapable of participating in the very ethical system he claims is universal. He reduces them from independent moral agents to aesthetic objects whose primary societal function is to make the world softer and more pleasant for the rational, sublime men who are out doing the hard work of governing.
That's exactly what he does.
And if Kant limits their moral agency, Jean-Jacques Rousseau provides the exact blueprint for how to enforce that limitation through education.
Rousseau is a fascinating figure here because he is the great philosopher of freedom. He famously wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Yet he actively designed a pedagogical chain for women.
In his book, Émile.
Yes, in his incredibly influential book, Émile, Rousseau outlines his theory of education. He describes how to raise a young boy, Émile, to be the ideal, natural, free citizen. Émile is taught to be fiercely independent, to think critically, and to rely on his own reason.
But then Rousseau introduces Sophie, who is destined to be Émile's wife, and the educational model he prescribes for her is the exact mirrored opposite of Émile's.
Rousseau explicitly argues that Sophie's education must be entirely relative. Where Émile is educated for independence, Sophie's educated for subjugation.
It's hard to read today.
He writes that a woman's entire education should be planned in relation to men to please them, to be useful to them, to win their love and respect, to raise them when they're young, and to comfort them when they are grown.
So her life isn't her own.
Her intellectual and moral development is not an end in itself. It is strictly tethered to Émile's needs. She is designed to be a complementary tool for his happiness.
Imagine being the philosopher who inspires the French Revolution, championing the inherent liberty of the human spirit, while simultaneously arguing that half the species should be systematically brainwashed to serve the other half.
It's a staggering contradiction.
And for those listening, I don't want you to think of Rousseau's Émile as just an old book. Think about how these Enlightenment paradoxes echo in the modern world. Think about the concept of office housework today. How women are still disproportionately expected to handle the organizing, the emotional labor, the team morale, while men are lauded for the sublime theoretical strategy.
It's a perfect modern parallel.
Or look at the silent expectations in modern relationships regarding whose career takes a back seat when childcare is required. We are still navigating the psychological architecture that Rousseau and Kant built.
That is a brilliant connection. The intellectual architecture laid down in the 18th century absolutely informs the unconscious biases of the 21st century.
Right.
But it's vital to recognize that this architecture did not go unchallenged.
Right.
The irony of the Enlightenment is that it provided the vocabulary of reason and rights, and brilliantly capable women picked up those tools and used them to dismantle the very arguments used against them.
Which transitions us beautifully from the architects of the cage to the pioneers of reason who struck back. Because women throughout history were not just passively accepting this ontological deficit. We have to look at figures who proved, through their sheer existence, that the system was a lie.
Yes, we do.
Let's start by rewinding slightly to antiquity, to Alexandria in the late 4th century, and the story of Hypatia.
Hypatia's story is as intellectually inspiring as it is historically tragic. Picture Alexandria during this period. It is a bustling, cosmopolitan nexus of the ancient world, housing incredible libraries and diverse scholars.
A real center of learning.
Exactly. At the very center of this intellectual ferment is Hypatia. She wasn't a token figure or a minor contributor. She was the preeminent master of mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonic philosophy of her time.
She is standing in front of mixed audiences of pagans and Christians, teaching the most complex, abstract, sublime thought imaginable. She is literally charting the movements of the stars. She is living proof that Aristotle's concept of the rationally deficient, mutilated male is empirical nonsense.
Exactly. Her brilliance was undeniable. But in a deeply patriarchal society undergoing massive religious upheaval, her intellectual authority made her a profound threat.
Right.
In 415 AD, the political and religious tensions in Alexandria boiled over. Hypatia was ambushed by a mob of religious zealots, dragged from her chariot, and brutally murdered in the streets.
This is a horrifying story.
Historians often cite her assassination not just as a tragedy, but as a symbolic turning point, the harrowing moment where the light of classical reason and philosophical inquiry was violently extinguished by rising dogmatism and fanaticism.
It is a stark reminder that challenging these deep-seated ontological deficits often carried fatal consequences. But the spark she represented couldn't be permanently extinguished. If we jump forward again to the height of the Enlightenment, we see women utilizing the printing press to mount a devastating defense.
Yes, Mary Wollstonecraft.
In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft publishes A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and she takes dead aim at Rousseau's Emile.
Wollstonecraft's critique is a masterstroke of logic. Rousseau argued that women are naturally foolish, frivolous, and obsessed with trivialities, which justifies their subjugation. Wollstonecraft essentially replies, of course they appear frivolous to you. You have locked them in a gilded cage and systematically denied them a rational education.
She is pointing out that he is confusing the symptom with the cause.
Precisely. Her core argument is that it is not biology or nature that makes women seem intellectually inferior. It is a society that artificially stunts their growth.
Makes sense.
If you treat a human being like a perpetual child, if you only teach them how to dress well, be charming, and cater to men, you cannot then turn around and claim they are naturally incapable of deep, rational thought.
You created the problem.
Right. Wollstonecraft demands a robust, rigorous, identical education for women. She argues that if given the same intellectual nourishment, women will prove themselves to be full moral and intellectual equals. She exposed the circular logic of the patriarchal establishment.
It is a brilliant, undeniable argument. But perhaps the most visceral, dramatic challenge to the Enlightenment's blind spot came directly from the fires of the French Revolution itself. Let's talk about Olympe de Gouges.
Oh, de Gouges is fascinating.
She watches the male revolutionaries draft the glorious Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. She sees them preaching universal liberty, and she realizes that man quite literally only means men. Women are completely excluded from political citizenship.
So she acts.
So in 1791, she drafts her own document, the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen.
And in that document, she embeds a piece of political logic that is absolutely flawless. Our sources highlight her most legendary quote. She wrote, "Woman has the right to mount the scaffold. She must equally have the right to mount the rostrum."
Okay, let's break down why that is so powerful.
The scaffold is where you are executed. The rostrum is the podium where you speak and participate in politics. Deguge is arguing that if a woman is considered enough of a rational, responsible subject to be held legally accountable by the state to be sentenced to death and executed for her crimes, then she absolutely must be considered enough of a rational subject to have political representation and free speech.
It's perfectly logical.
You cannot impose the ultimate punishment of the law upon women without granting them the rights of the law.
It is checkmate. It exposes the utter hypocrisy of the revolutionary government. But the horrifying irony of this story is that the men in power proved her point in the most tragic way possible.
They did.
Because Deguge dared to demand these political rights, and because she criticized the radical, bloodthirsty factions of the revolution, she was arrested. She was tried for treason, and she was sent to the guillotine. She mounted the scaffold, exactly as she predicted, executed by a system that refused to let her mount the rostrum.
It is a chilling conclusion to her life. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the intellectual sacrifices of Hypatia, Wollstonecraft, and Deguge's accomplished something fundamental.
What was that?
They proved that the rules of the philosophical establishment were not objective truths of nature. They were arbitrary, constructed barriers designed to maintain power. By proving that the script was written by men rather than decreed by biology, they paved the way for the existentialists to come along and completely blow the doors off the concept of identity.
And before we get to the 20th century, we have to navigate one of the most provocative, complex, and misunderstood philosophers in history when it comes to the subject of women. We have to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes.
Now, if the average person knows a single quote from Nietzsche regarding women, it is undoubtedly this infamous line from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "You're going to women, do not forget the whip."
It is a quote that has fueled countless accusations of deep-seated misogyny.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because on the surface, if you just read that out of context, it sounds completely indefensible. It sounds like pure, unadulterated violence. It sounds like he is telling men they need to physically dominate and tame women. How do our sources contextualize this so it isn't just a horrific endorsement of abuse?
Reading Nietzsche literally is almost always a philosophical mistake. He is a writer of extreme metaphors, irony, and deep psychological provocation. To truly understand the implication of the whip, we have to look outside the text and examine the historical context, specifically a very famous, highly staged photograph involving Nietzsche.
This is where the story gets fascinating. Okay, picture this. Nietzsche is close friends with a brilliant, fiercely independent, and highly charismatic young intellectual named Lou Salome, along with another philosopher named Paul Ray. The three of them go to a photography studio in 1882 and set up a highly specific shot. In the photograph, Nietzsche and Ray are positioned at the front of a small cart, leaning forward, acting like beasts of burden. And who is standing up in the cart, holding the reins and holding a small whip? Lou Salome.
That visual detail completely inverts the superficial reading of the text. In the photograph, the woman is the one holding the whip. She's the one in control, driving the cart, while the great male philosophers are reduced to clumsy, driven animals.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
When we apply this context, rigorous philosophical analysis suggests that the whip in Zarathustra does not represent man's physical dominance over woman. Rather, it represents woman's power, her critical distance, and her innate ability to tame man's base animalistic instincts.
Hold on, so when the old woman in his book gives Zarathustra the advice, do not forget the whip, she might actually be warning the man, don't forget that she has the whip, don't forget her power. It completely flips the power dynamic.
Precisely. For Nietzsche, woman operated as a metaphor for truth. And you have to understand that Nietzsche did not view truth as some boring, static, objective fact you find in a science textbook.
Right.
For him, truth is elusive. It wears masks, it keeps its distance, it seduces, and it possesses a terrifying depth beneath a beautiful surface. He viewed the feminine through this lens.
And this ties back to his absolute hatred for the Enlightenment, right?
Yes. Nietzsche despised the Enlightenment's impulse to categorize everything, to make everything transparent, equal, and purely rational. He felt that the modern bureaucratic push to make women equal to men, to make them just as flat, predictable, and rationally boring as men, was actually destroying what he saw as a unique, powerful, and mysterious feminine genius.
So he valued the mystery.
He valued the mask, the seduction, the unpredictable power that he associated with women, and he feared that modern equality would erase it.
I have to challenge that a bit, though. Isn't romanticizing women as elusive, mystical truth just another way of projecting an idea onto them? It's certainly better than Aristotle calling them defective incubators, but it still feels like a male philosopher using the concept of woman as a prop for his own theories about truth, rather than letting women just be human beings.
That is an entirely valid, highly astute critique. He is absolutely still projecting a grand metaphor onto the female form. However, what is undeniable is that Nietzsche represents a massive shift in the ontological status of women in philosophy.
How so?
He moves the needle from viewing women as deficient to viewing them as possessing a profound, albeit dangerous, power. He shatters the Enlightenment's neat little boxes.
And once those boxes are shattered, the stage is set for the mid-20th century, where the metaphors are stripped away entirely and we get down to the raw, unvarnished mechanics of existence. We arrive at the existential revolution, spearheaded by the incomparable Simone de Beauvoir. In 1949, she publishes The Second Sex, and she drops a sentence that fundamentally alters the trajectory of human thought. One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman.
That single sentence is an absolute earthquake. With those words, she takes a sledgehammer to Aristotle, to Kant, to Rousseau. She's declaring that there is no biological destiny.
There's no essence.
Exactly. There's no innate, unchangeable, mystical female essence that you are born with. Femininity is not a fact of nature. It is an entirely cultural construct.
To understand the weight of how she reached that conclusion, we need to dive into the philosophical machinery she was using. Beauvoir was an existentialist, but our sources point out that she leaned heavily on the dialectic of an earlier philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, specifically the concept of the subject versus the other. Can you break that down?
Hegel argued that human consciousness defines itself through opposition. We understand who we are by contrasting ourselves with what we are not. I establish myself as a subject, a center of consciousness and agency, by recognizing that you are an other. It is a fundamental mechanism of identity formation.
It's how we orient ourselves in the world.
Exactly. But Beauvoir looked at the vast sweep of human history and realized that this basic human dynamic had been completely and systematically hijacked by gender. Historically, man has universally positioned himself as the absolute, the transcendent, the default setting for humanity. He is the ultimate subject.
And woman.
By defining himself as the universal norm, he has forced woman into the permanent role of the other. She is the incidental. She is the immanent. She is defined not by what she inherently is, but purely in relation to what she is not. She is not man. He is the standard. She is the deviation.
Which perfectly mirrors Aristotle's biology. The male is the target, the female is the miss. It's the same concept, updated for the 20th century. But Beauvoir uses two very specific, highly loaded existential terms that we really need to unpack for the listener: immanence and transcendence.
These concepts are the beating heart of her philosophy. Let's define them clearly. Immanence is a state of stagnation. It is being trapped in the present moment, weighed down by repetitive cyclical tasks that merely sustain biological life, but do not create anything new or lasting.
And transcendence.
Transcendence, on the other hand, is the quintessential human drive to project oneself into the future. It is the act of creating, inventing, shaping the world, and leaving a historical legacy.
I think we need a modern analogy here to really make immanence click. Think about it like being the IT department for a massive company that builds spaceships. You are there to keep the servers running, fix the Wi-Fi, and ensure the emails go through. Your work is absolutely vital. Without you, the company collapses.
Right.
But you aren't the one designing the rocket. You aren't the one going to space. Your name isn't on the side of the ship. Your entire existence is about maintaining the baseline so someone else can achieve greatness. That maintenance work, doing the dishes, sweeping the floor, the endless loop of domesticity that is immanence, it is a closed loop. Transcendence is building the rocket.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And Beauvoir's devastating critique was that society, for centuries, had monopolized transcendence entirely for men. Men were encouraged, even expected, to go out into the public sphere, make history, write laws, and build rockets.
While women were kept inside.
Yes. Women, however, were forcibly confined to the immanent prison. They were locked in the oikos, restricted to biological reproduction, and burdened with the repetitive tasks of caretaking. They were systematically denied the opportunity to transcend their circumstances and act upon the world.
But Beauvoir didn't just diagnose the disease. She offered a very specific prescription for how to break out of the cage. And it wasn't just about changing your mindset.
No, she was highly pragmatic. Her call to action was that women had to step out of this immanent prison, and the master key to the lock was economic independence. You cannot be a free, transcendent subject if you are entirely reliant on a man for your literal survival. You have to enter the workforce, you have to earn your own capital, and you have to engage dynamically in the public sphere.
And for those of you listening, apply this to your own life. Think about the moments where you feel trapped in a loop of immanence, just grinding through the day, paying bills, doing laundry, versus the moments of transcendence, where you are actively building your future, creating art, or advancing your career. Beauvoir is arguing that this pursuit of transcendence is not a male privilege. It is a fundamental, non-negotiable human right.
And that profound realization that femininity is a social construct rather than a biological destiny sets the stage for the next massive paradigm-shattering shift in philosophy. Because if Beauvoir says society puts you in a cage based on your biology, the thinkers of the late 20th century take it a step further.
What happens when we realize that you aren't just placed in the cage, but you are actively, albeit unconsciously, performing the cage into existence? Here's where it gets really interesting. We arrived at the 1990s and the groundbreaking work of Judith Butler. In 1990, she publishes Gender Trouble, and she introduces the concept of gender as a performance. Now, if Beauvoir said that sex is biological but gender is cultural, meaning you are born female, but society turns you into a woman, Butler looks at that divide and says, hold on a second, I don't even think biological sex exists outside of culture.
It is a radically destabilizing thought. Butler's argument is immensely complex, but at its core, she suggests that the very scientific and medical lenses through which we view biological sex are already deeply infused with cultural assumptions and binary thinking. However, her most famous lasting contribution to philosophy is the concept of performativity.
Let's define performativity carefully because it's very easy to misunderstand. It is not the same as putting on a performance like an actor in a play, right?
Exactly. When we say performance in layman's terms, it implies that there is a real authentic you hiding behind a mask, and you are just choosing to put on a show for a little while. Performativity is much deeper. It means that the repetitive act itself creates the reality.
So it's an action.
Butler argues that gender is not a noun, it is a verb. It is not something you are, it is something you do. It is a script we constantly perform.
We do gender through millions of tiny repetitive acts every single day. The way we walk, the clothes we are given, the pitch of our voice we adopt, the way we cross our legs, the grooming habits we maintain. Society hands us a script the moment the doctor says it's a boy or it's a girl, and we perform those acts so consistently, so relentlessly over a lifetime, that it creates the powerful illusion that there is a natural, fixed, biological essence inside of us driving those behaviors.
Think of it like walking a path through a virgin field of grass. If one person walks across it, nothing changes. But if everyone walks the exact same route, day after day, year after year, eventually the grass dies and a deep, hard-packed dirt road forms.
I love that visual.
It looks completely natural. It looks like it's always been there, a permanent feature of the landscape. But it only exists because of the repeated collective action of people walking on it. Butler is saying gender is that dirt path. We perform it into existence through repetition.
But I want to play devil's advocate here because a lot of people struggle with this. If society writes the script and we just perform the path into existence, does biology not matter at all to Butler? Are we just blank slates entirely written on by culture?
It's an important pushback. Butler isn't denying that physical bodies exist or that there are physiological differences. What she is arguing is that the meaning we assign to those physical bodies, the immense societal weight, the expectations, the rigid binary of masculine and feminine is entirely constructed. The body exists, but gender is the cultural apparatus built on top of it. And crucially, because it's a performance based on a script, Butler suggests we have the power to mess with the script.
Right. If the rigid heteronormative binary is just a constructed illusion maintained by repetition, then we can subvert it. By exaggerating, mixing, or deliberately playing with gender roles, she often points to the culture of drag as an example. We expose the fact that it was all a constructed performance to begin with. We show the audience the wires holding up the stage lights.
And it is important to note as we analyze these sources that we are exploring Butler's sociological theories here as powerful analytical frameworks to understand identity, not declaring them as absolute, unquestionable political dogmas. What Butler fundamentally achieves is a shift in philosophical focus.
She changes the question being asked.
She moves the conversation away from asking what is the true essence of a woman to asking what are the societal mechanisms and power structures that produce the category of woman in the first place. It's a shift from ontology to power dynamics.
It's a total deconstruction of identity. But once you deconstruct identity like that, you are forced to look at how these different constructed identities actually interact with each other in the messy reality of the real world. Which brings us to the late 20th and 21st centuries and the development of modern frameworks, intersectionality, and care ethics.
Right.
Because as feminist philosophy evolved, thinkers began to realize a massive flaw in the early movements. Treating women as one giant, uniform, monolithic group simply wasn't reflecting reality.
Because the lived experience of being a woman is not uniform. The barriers faced by a wealthy white woman in New York are fundamentally different from the barriers faced by a working-class black woman in the American South. This realization birthed Kimberly Crenshaw's groundbreaking concept of intersectionality.
How did she develop that?
Crenshaw, functioning as a legal scholar, recognized that the traditional frameworks of anti-discrimination law were completely failing people who belonged to more than one marginalized group.
To truly grasp intersectionality, we have to look at the legal case that inspired it. DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors. Black women were suing GM for discrimination, but the courts looked at it and said, well, GM hires white women for secretarial roles, and GM hires black men for factory floor roles. Therefore, GM doesn't discriminate against women or black people. The court demanded the plaintiffs pick one axis of oppression. They asked, are you suing for gender discrimination or racial discrimination?
And that is where Crenshaw introduced her incredibly vivid analogy of the traffic intersection. Imagine an intersection where two busy roads cross. One road represents gender bias, and the other road represents racial bias. If a person is standing in the middle of that intersection and an accident happens, the harm didn't just come from one direction. The collision is a compounding of both forces.
It comes from everywhere.
Crenshaw pointed out that a black woman isn't just dealing with the sexism a white woman faces, plus the racism a black man faces. She is standing precisely at the intersection, experiencing a unique, compounded, synthesized form of marginalization that traditional, single-issue legal systems were utterly blind to.
It is a conceptual lens that adds crucial, high-definition resolution to our understanding of society. You cannot separate the intertwined threads of a person's existence. And alongside this socio-political evolution, modern philosophy also witnessed a radical restructuring of ethics itself, primarily through the work of thinkers like Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings, who developed what is known as care ethics.
To appreciate the magnitude of care ethics, we had to cast our minds back to Immanuel Kant. Remember Kant's focus on abstract, rational, isolated moral duty.
Right, doing duty just for the sake of duty.
The idea that true ethics is about discovering cold, universal laws that apply to everyone, everywhere, completely devoid of emotion or personal attachment. Care ethics argues that this Kantian model is essentially a massive generalization of the traditional male experience of the world, an experience focused on autonomy, legal contracts, and abstract public rules.
Right, and care ethics steps in and says, wait a minute, human beings are not isolated, purely rational calculators floating in a vacuum. We are deeply, inherently, biologically relational. From the absolute moment we are born, we rely entirely on others to survive. Morality shouldn't just be an abstract math problem about universal justice. It should be rooted in human bonds, in empathy, and in the actual daily practices of caretaking.
It represents a profound shift in philosophical priority. Care ethics argues that our primary moral obligations do not arise from abstract universal laws, but from the specific, concrete, messy relationships we have with the people around us.
Which is how most people actually live.
Exactly. It places immense value on responsiveness, emotional connection, and the active maintenance of human webs of interdependence. Instead of standing back and asking, what is the universal objective rule here? A care ethicist asks, how do we best maintain, heal, and nurture the specific relationships involved in this situation?
What I love about this is that it takes the imminent work that Beauvoir warned about, the caretaking, the nurturing, the sustaining of daily life, and it doesn't just validate it. It elevates it. It transforms it from a mere biological chore that women were forced into the very foundational bedrock of human morality.
It completely shifts philosophy from the lone genius model to a deeply interconnected human experience.
Which serves as the perfect logical bridge to our final conceptual destination today. We turn to Turkey's philosophical legacy and the monumental contributions of Professor Dr. Ioana Kusarati regarding universal dignity.
Kusarati is a towering figure in contemporary philosophy. She served as the president of the International Federation of Philosophical Societies, and her work feels like the ultimate beautiful culmination of this entire massive journey we have been on.
It really does.
It does, because Kusarati manages to elevate the entire conversation beyond the exhausting dialectics we've been discussing for the past hour. We have spent this deep dive talking about men versus women, subject versus other, immanence versus transcendence, performativity, and intersecting axes of oppression. Kusarati's extensive work on human rights philosophy and ethical values seeks to transcend narrow identity politics altogether. She wants to root the conversation in something much deeper, universal, ontological human dignity.
But what does that actually look like in practice? Human dignity can sometimes sound like a political buzzword. How does she define it philosophically?
For Kusarati, ethical action is ultimately about creating the conditions for what she calls humanization. It is about recognizing that every single individual possesses inherent worth simply by virtue of being human, and ethics is the active practice of protecting and realizing that worth.
So it's an active process.
Humanization is the process of allowing a person to actualize their full potential. In this framework, ensuring the presence and full participation of women in every level of society isn't seen as a political favor granted by men. It isn't merely a byproduct of progressive sociology.
It is a fundamental requirement of human value. You cannot claim to have a society that values human dignity if half of its members are systematically denied the opportunity to undergo that process of humanization. Her philosophy provides a grounding that entirely bypasses the traps of Aristotle's flawed biology or Kant's exclusionary aesthetics. It cuts through the noise and says simply you possess absolute worth because you are human, full stop.
It is a return to a truly universal standard, one that doesn't carry the silent asterisks of the Enlightenment. It provides a robust, unshakable philosophical foundation for human rights that isn't dependent on performing a specific gender script or navigating intersecting oppressions. It is a unifying place to land.
It really is. And that brings us to the conclusion of our deep dive. We have covered an astonishing, dizzying amount of ground today. We started in the smoke and mirrors of the fabricated 1857 New York fire and the gritty, empire-toppling reality of the 1917 Petrograd strikes.
I really went everywhere.
We walked through the columns of Aristotle's Lyceum to dissect the biological deficit. We debated the terrifying paradoxes of the Enlightenment with Kant and Rousseau, and we cheered for the brilliant pioneers of reason like Hypatia, Wollstonecraft, and de Gouges. We untangled the metaphors of Nietzsche's whip. We broke out of Beauvoir's imminent prison. We analyzed the performative stage with Butler. We navigated the traffic intersections of Crenshaw. And finally, we found solid ground in Kusarati's universal dignity.
It is a staggering historical and intellectual trajectory. And what I hope is abundantly clear to anyone listening is that the history of women's rights is not merely a timeline of legal milestones or political protests. It is an ongoing, profound philosophical struggle. It is the relentless struggle to define, defend, and constantly redefine what it means to be fully, comprehensively human.
The mirror of philosophy has been held by many different hands over the millennia, and for a long time it only reflected a very narrow fraction of humanity. But thanks to the thinkers we've explored today, that reflection is finally starting to look like all of us. Before we let you go, as always, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day.
If identity is indeed shaped by the massive philosophical scripts we've inherited, if it is, in part, a daily performance, as Butler suggests, take a quiet moment to look at the script you are performing today. Which parts of your identity, your habits, your expectations did you actively write for yourself, and which parts were quietly handed to you by the weight of history? And more importantly, if the script was written by others, how might you begin to rewrite it tomorrow?
Don't forget to follow us and subscribe to stay updated on our latest episodes and never miss a step in this odyssey of thought. Until next time, keep questioning.